33.9 kilometers of wall. Not across land, across open sea. Twice a day, the tide behind it rises nearly 6 meters and tries to take it back. 401 square kilometers of the Yellow Sea, sealed shut behind a single earthen ridge of sand and stone. Engineers had never closed a gap this wide against currents this strong, and for years, the standard fix, dump more rock into the water, simply stopped working. What finally closed it wasn't more rock. It was rock that had learned to bend. This is the full breakdown of how that gap actually shut, stone by stone, tide by tide, and what it cost on 2 separate ledgers that nobody involved has fully settled yet. Start with the water itself, because the water is the real opponent in this story. The Yellow Sea is shallow and semi-enclosed, narrowing like a funnel between the Korean peninsula and mainland China. And a shallow, tapering basin does to tidal water almost exactly what a narrowing riverbed does to a flood. It has nowhere to spread, so it piles up instead. Off the coast near the port city of Gunsan, that funnel effect produces one of the most tidally violent stretches of coastline on the planet. On a spring tide, the water rises and falls by up to 5.7 meters, twice a day, every day, on a schedule set by the moon rather than any construction crew. 2 rivers, the Dongjin and the Saemangeum, empty into the bay at that stretch of coast. In November 1991, the South Korean government announced a plan to dam both river mouths at once and seal the entire bay between them behind a single continuous wall, closing off 401 square kilometers of open tidal sea, an area close to 2/3 the size of Seoul itself. Behind that wall, planners intended to build 2 things: a 118 square kilometer freshwater reservoir and 283 square kilometers of new farmland, expected to grow close to 10% of the country's total rice supply. The wall meant to hold all of it back would have to run 33.9 kilometers, most of it across water that had never held anything permanent before. Most reclamation projects work a single river mouth or a sheltered cove, someplace the water is already inclined to slow down. This bay had no such shelter. It opened directly onto the Yellow Sea, and every design decision from that point forward had to answer to a simple, brutal fact. The wider the gap still open, the more of that tidal violence had to pass through it, twice a day, for as long as it took to close. South Korea is one of the most mountainous countries in Asia relative to its size, and flat farmland has always been scarce here. Small-scale coastal reclamation had been part of the national playbook for generations before Saemangeum. But nothing at that scale, on that stretch of coast, against tides this strong, had ever been attempted. The larger the wall grew, the harder the water still moving through what was left of it became to control. That's the trap this whole project would spend 19 years trying to escape. You cannot pour a concrete wall across 34 kilometers of open, moving sea. Not economically, and not physically. A rigid structure needs a stable foundation, and the seabed under this bay is the opposite of stable. Soft, saturated tidal mud, rearranged by the current twice a day for thousands of years. Pour concrete on that, and the ground it's sitting on shifts out from under it before it ever has a chance to cure. So engineers built with what the coast already had. The dike is an earthen embankment, a core of sand, dredged straight from the seabed and pumped ashore, faced with heavy rock to keep the sides from washing away. Unlike concrete, an earthen structure can settle and flex with a shifting foundation instead of cracking against it. Built up gradually in stages from both ends at once, one crew advancing south from Gunsan, another pushing north from Buon County, aiming to meet somewhere in the middle of the bay. The finished dike would average 290 meters wide at its base and 36 meters tall, reaching 54 meters at its most reinforced sections, and 535 meters wide, wider than 5 football fields laid end to end. Most of that structure, roughly 2/3 of it, sits entirely below the waterline. Drive across the finished road on top of it today, and you're crossing something taller than most of the apartment buildings in the city you just left, with almost none of it visible. None of it ran on an ordinary construction schedule. Certain work was only possible in the narrow windows around slack water, the few minutes when the tide briefly stops reversing, and crews learned to plan entire days around a timetable the moon controlled rather than a foreman. Construction ran through 15 full annual cycles of monsoon season and coastal storms, each one a rehearsal for the load the finished wall would eventually have to carry permanently, with no crew standing by to fix anything. The physics turned against the builders hardest in the final stretch. Close off enough of a tidal bay, and the same volume of water that used to spread across the whole open mouth gets forced through whatever gap is left. Shrink that gap further, and the water doesn't slow down to compensate. It speeds up, because the same tidal volume now has less room to pass through twice a day. Every meter of visible progress on the wall made the water still moving through the part that wasn't finished yet faster and more dangerous to work in. By the time only 2 channels remained, each 2.7 kilometers wide, ordinary rock dropped into place by barge and crane was being swept away almost as fast as crews could place it. The last stretch of open water, the easiest part to describe and the hardest part to actually close, was the one nobody yet had a reliable method for. Part of the answer had already been built into the project years before the closing problem became urgent, even if nobody framed it that way yet. Instead of relying only on quarried rock to retain the sand core of the dike as it rose, engineers turned to geotextile tubes, long fabric sleeves, laid end-to-end like sandbags built at industrial scale, then filled in place by pumping sand slurry through a fitted sleeve until each tube swelled tight and settled under its own weight. More than 26 kilometers of them went into the dike. The switch away from a conventional rock-fill berm design saved a documented $6.2 million and 7 months of construction time, and, as an afterthought, nobody was optimizing for at the time, cut the project's carbon footprint by more than 230,000 tons of CO2, over half of what the original rock-fill design would have produced. That solved the buildup. It didn't solve the closing. As the final 2 gaps narrowed toward their last few hundred meters, standard loose riprap, the large armor stones normally dumped in to block a gap, stopped holding. The current moving through that shrinking opening was strong enough to tumble ordinary stone away before it settled, and every attempt to narrow the gap further risked undoing the attempt before it. The fix that finally worked was almost embarrassingly simple in concept. Gabions. Wire mesh cages packed with a mix of rock and gravel dropped into place instead of loose stone. A single boulder dropped into fast-moving water either sits still or rolls away. There's no in-between state for a rigid, isolated object. A gabion does neither. It deforms around whatever's underneath it and interlocks with the bags dropped beside it, spreading the load across the whole mass instead of resisting the current alone as a single point of failure. Engineers studying the closure afterward confirmed exactly why this mattered. At the specific currents this project was fighting, gabions held where loose riprap of the same size and weight simply washed out, and the right ratio of riprap to gabion had to be worked out specifically for this gap, at this current, on this coastline, not borrowed wholesale from anywhere else. Combined with a method engineers called vertical and horizontal closure, raising the height of the entire gap's floor at the same time as narrowing its width, instead of just piling stone higher in one spot, the gabions finally gave crews a way to close a gap that loose rock, on its own, never could. None of this happened without a fight, and not just the hydraulic kind. In 2001, environmental groups and local residents filed suit against the government, backing the legal case with demonstrations and religious and cultural protest ceremonies staged at the water's edge. For the fishing and shellfish gathering communities who lived along the estuary, the tidal flats were never just scenery. Generations had made a living pulling clams and shellfish from the mud at low tide, work that depended entirely on the flats staying flats, open, wet, and tidal. A wall that turned that mud permanently dry or permanently underwater didn't threaten an abstraction. It threatened the next paycheck. Construction was suspended while the courts weighed in, then resumed under court order. The fight ran 4 years and 7 months. On February 4, 2005, an administrative court ruled partially in the plaintiff's favor. 10 months later, on December 21, 2005, a higher court reversed that ruling. And on March 16, 2006, Barely 5 weeks before crews closed the final gap, the Supreme Court issued its final word, siding with the government. The legal door and the physical one closed within the same month of each other. But the deepest problem with this project was never really a courtroom argument. It was the project's own original reason for existing. The dike had been justified, from the start, as a food security measure, a way to grow more rice on a peninsula running short of farmland. By 1996, 5 years into construction, South Korea was already producing more rice than it consumed, and it has run a surplus every year since. The shortage the entire project was built to solve had ended before the wall was even finished, and 2 decades later, the country was net importing rice, even as this project's newly reclaimed paddies came online. Paddies that, when farmers actually tried to run them at a profit, mostly couldn't. A 2010 academic study went further than the timing was bad. Published in the Journal of the Korean Society for Marine Environment and Energy, it described this kind of large-scale tidal reclamation as close to the worst-case outcome for a coastal ecosystem. The kind of project that doesn't just disrupt a tidal flat, but inevitably destroys it. That verdict arrived after the wall was already standing, built to solve a shortage that no longer existed. The closure came in 2 stages, 11 months apart in planning terms and 3 years apart in the calendar. The dike's northern opening, the smaller of the 2 remaining gaps, closed first, on June 10, 2003, without needing the gabion technique at all. That left the 2 southern gaps, each 2.7 kilometers wide, now carrying the full tidal exchange of the entire 401 square kilometer bay through a fraction of the original opening. Those 2 gaps could not be closed one at a time. Seal one first, and the entire remaining tidal volume of the whole bay would have concentrated through the other, a channel already struggling to hold ordinary rock in place, suddenly facing a current beyond anything the design accounted for. So on April 21, 2006, crews closed both gaps simultaneously, trucks running rock and gabion bags onto both crests at once, raising the sill of each gap in coordination through repeated tidal cycles, a little higher with every slack water window, until the current on both sides no longer had the force to move what had been dropped into it. That day marked the effective completion of the wall, though the public wouldn't walk across it for another 4 years. Crews spent the time reinforcing the embankment and inspecting it through repeated tidal cycles, while the newly enclosed water began its slow conversion into the planned reservoir and farmland. 2 drainage gates were built into the finished structure to manage that ongoing exchange. Cincy, with 10 radial gates, and Garioch, with 8, opened or closed depending on whether the reservoir needed more seawater flushed out or more freshwater held in. Only once the dike had proven it could hold through full tidal cycles, season after season, with no new weak points opening under real load, did the government consider it finished enough to open. When it officially opened to the public on April 27, 2010, 19 years after construction began, then-President Lee Myung-bak called it the kernel and the gateway of South Korea's West Coast industrial belt. 4 months later, Guinness World Records made it official. The longest seawall on Earth, 500 meters longer than the Netherlands' Afsluitdijk. That record was not an easy one to take. The Afsluitdijk had held it since 1932, built in just 5 years as an emergency response to a 1916 storm flood that killed dozens of people and destroyed thousands of homes around the old Zuiderzee. Flood safety first, land reclamation second. This wall had no single catastrophe forcing its hand. It took nearly 4 times as long to build, driven the entire way by a plan for farmland and industry rather than a disaster nobody wanted repeated. 78 years after the Afsluitdijk was finished, its record fell anyway, to a wall built out of sand, gabions, and 19 years of tidal patience. Set the 2 ledgers about money side by side, and the shape of the project gets clearer. The wall itself, the dike, its reinforcement, and the initial conversion of the enclosed water into farmland and reservoir cost close to 3.3 trillion won, roughly $3.1 billion, spent across the 15 years between the 1991 groundbreaking and the 2006 closure. That's the number for the wall alone. The number for everything the wall was meant to enable is a different order of magnitude. Over 22.7 trillion won total. Government funding, local funding, and private investment combined. Somewhere between $16 and $20 billion depending on the exchange rate, and still climbing more than 3 decades after the first shovel went into the ground. As of the most recent public assessment, the full development stood at only 42.8% complete. The wall, finished in 2010, had been the fast part. Some of what that money is now building is genuinely striking. On the reservoir behind the dike, South Korea is constructing a floating solar plant designed to reach 2.1 gigawatts across 2 stages, 1.2 gigawatts followed by a further 900 megawatts, using more than 5 million solar panels across roughly 30 square kilometers of water. At full capacity, it's about 14 times larger than the plant that, before this one, held the world record for floating solar, a 150 megawatt installation in Anhui, China. Projected output is enough to cover the electricity demand of about 1 million households, generated on the same water that used to be one of the richest tidal ecosystems on the Korean coast. In February 2026, Hyundai Motor Group announced a 9 trillion won investment, roughly $6.3 billion, the single largest private commitment the region has ever received, to build an artificial intelligence data center running 50,000 GPUs, a robotics manufacturing cluster, and a hydrogen electrolysis plant on ground that was open ocean 35 years ago. The government's own projection puts the total population the finished development will eventually support at 706,000 people. None of that population exists yet. Almost none of the connecting infrastructure, a 48-kilometer rail line, a new airport runway, is finished. All of it is being built, piece by piece, on ground that in 1991 was underwater twice a day. None of those numbers, not the 3 billion, not the 20 billion, not the 706,000 future residents, include what was actually living there before the wall went up. Before construction began, this stretch of tidal flat supported at least 330,000 migratory shorebirds every year, including close to a third of the entire world population of the Great Knot, on a flyway stretching from the Arctic tundra of Russia and Alaska down to Australia and New Zealand. In the 2 years after the final gap closed in 2006, shorebird numbers at the site and its neighboring wetlands fell by 130,000. A separate study tracking the site through 2008 counted a loss of 137,000 waterbirds, 90,000 of them great knots, close to a quarter of that species' entire global population, gone from one site in 2 years. By 2014, national surveys found fewer than 5,000 shorebirds using the site during spring migration. Researchers looking for evidence that the displaced birds had simply relocated somewhere else along the Korean coast found none. The population had collapsed instead. The Far Eastern curlew, one of the flyway's largest and most recognizable shorebirds, is specifically documented among the species hit hardest by the loss. This is the largest single example of that collapse on the Yellow Sea, but not the only one. Across the whole sea, shared between China and South Korea, roughly 2/3 of all tidal flat area has disappeared over the last 50 years to reclamation projects like this one. Habitat that more than 50 million birds across 210 species rely on every year, including 33 species found nowhere else in comparable numbers. One person kept looking anyway. A filmmaker named Hwang Yun had spent years documenting these tidal flats before the 2006 closure, and stopped filming when the gap closed, believing there was nothing left worth pointing a camera at. Years later, living in Gunsan, she found a single flat that had somehow survived. Locals called it Sura. Her 2022 documentary about it, made alongside a citizens survey group that has monitored the site for nearly 20 years, is built entirely around that one surviving patch of mud nobody expected to still be there. South Korea built something that had never been built before, the longest wall of its kind on Earth, a foundation for a still unfinished $20 billion region, engineered around a hydraulic problem nobody had solved at this scale. It also erased, in under a decade, one of the most important shorebird stopover sites on the planet, and 35 years on, the region still hasn't fully decided what it was for. Both of those things are true about the same 33.9 kilometers of sand and rock. If stories like this, where an engineering triumph and an unresolved cost turn out to be exactly the same project, are what you're here for, subscribe, because the next one starts on ground just as unlikely as this.